Learning to program from scratch with no prior experience is very difficult. And a common thing I always hear from people just learning, they get frustrated. It's just, I'm just not getting it. I can't get this stuff. And more often than not, it comes down to a lack of patience and a lack of willingness to put in the time, put in the effort, put in the hours, put in the repetitions to practice this stuff and get good at it. Right? Think about any other skill you've ever learned, whether you're playing a sport, basketball, football, playing a video game, or dancing, or gardening, or woodworking, whatever your hobby is, whatever you're good at, how did you get good at it? You did it 1,000 times, right? You put in so many hours, that's how you got good at it, and programming is no different. And I think where a lot of beginner developers mess up is two, they're not willing to put in that work, or maybe their expectations weren't set correctly, that this is hard, it's gonna take a long time, it's gonna take a lot of practice, but they're not willing to do that, not willing to go back and repeat stuff and put in the reps. And I also think they try to build an actual product that the idea they have, maybe the inspiration for why they learned how to code before learning the fundamentals. And I totally understand, that's the fun part, right? Probably what inspired you to learn how to code. Maybe you had an app idea, a website idea, and you just want to build that, right? You learn a little bit and you start tinkering around with that. And I've been there, I understand that's the fun part. Sometimes the fundamentals aren't that fun, but I like to think of it like this chart. And the bottom one that starts off slow and then curves up rapidly, that is you taking the time to put in the reps early, learn the fundamentals, get good at those. That will speed you up so much in the future. It's like a good investment. Whereas, yes, you can still make progress, just like trying to build your product right away and learning what you need to learn as you go, but you're not gonna understand the underlying fundamentals and you're just gonna move slowly and slowly. So while in the beginning, taking the time to practice may seem like you're not making progress, like you see in this chart, it really makes up for itself in the long run. Because think about it, jumping right into trying to build a product when you don't understand how to program, that would be like going and playing a basketball game when you're still learning how to dribble and shoot. That's not gonna go well. Or what if you hopped in a video game tournament and you don't even know what the buttons do? It's just not gonna go well. It's gonna be rough. So what do I mean by learn the fundamentals? I'm talking about the fundamentals of your platform. For me, I'm an iOS developer, so that would be learning iOS and iPhones, iPads. Learn the fundamentals of that platform, that language. If you're a web developer, same thing. If you're a game developer, same thing. I'm not necessarily talking about, computer science fundamentals, data structures and algorithms, binary trees. I'm not saying those are useless at all. That's great knowledge. But again, for the beginners trying to learn programming for the first time and you don't have a computer science degree background, it's probably better to start again with the fundamentals of your platform. So as an iOS developer, let's use the iPhone as an example, right? You're building a bunch of small little apps and let's just call them projects because you're not building a full consumer app, right? Maybe you build something with the camera where you can, take a picture and put a filter on it. So, something simple. Maybe you work with maps for a little bit. Maybe you work with ARKit, have some fun. Maybe build a little game. Just a bunch of different little apps that are just small projects that you can, again, learn the fundamentals of your platform and its repetition, right? Because a lot of the programming basics and concepts you'll reuse from app to app to app. So that's how you get that repetition. That's how you get that practice. And like I said, it may seem like you're just kind of wasting your time on these small projects, but back to this chart, over the long run, getting this experience, learning the fundamentals of your platform will pay off. Maybe you've been in the situation where you've asked a more senior developer, a more experienced one, a question, and they know the answer off the top of their head. It's not because they just watched one tutorial and they got it. No, they've probably done that thing 1,000 times, or they struggled for so long on that topic, banged their head against it, finally had that breakthrough moment, so much so that they'll never forget, right? They really struggled with it. And again, that's what it takes. It takes the repetition, takes the struggle, takes the practice. And again, I think the fault of a lot of beginners is, again, maybe their expectations weren't set properly, but they're just not willing to do that. They're not willing to do the repetitions, do the practice. So that's why I always recommend building these small projects. I use iOS as an example, but if you're a web developer, build some small websites. If you're a game developer, build a bunch of different small games. Maybe try playing around with a first-person shooter, a real-time strategy game, a fighter, a shoot 'em up. Just do a lot of variety within your field, but again, keep them super small, keep them to experiments. But a good side effect of building all these small projects, showcasing your skills, is you're gonna kind of build a little bit of a portfolio along the way. When it comes time to get that first job, you can showcase what you've built, your work. The infinite loop. Every time I decide to go all in and learn everything SwiftUI, I feel like I'm missing out by not learning more UIKit. And when I decide to go all in on UIKit, I feel like I'm missing out on getting ahead by focusing on SwiftUI. And here's my response. In late 2022, a beginner iOS dev will be fine either way. Whether you go all in on UIKit, you'll be fine, you can make it work. Whether you go all in on SwiftUI, you'll be fine, you can make it work, right? That's why I said both paths can work. The bigger mistake is trying to learn both at the same time, especially with SwiftUI and UIKit, because those are two different ways of thinking. That's imperative programming versus declarative programming. I can't even imagine as a beginner, like learning to code and program is hard enough as it is as a very beginner, let alone trying to learn imperative and declarative at the same time. That's just gonna stunt your growth. Pick a path, go all in, learn the other one later. And the first thing that I would recommend to my former self is to not stay in what I call the tutorial trap for so long. What is the tutorial trap? Well, I think a lot of us fall into this where we just enjoy learning, right? We like learning new things. So we see this bright new shiny toy and it's like, oh, let me do a tutorial on that. And when you're just learning, don't get me wrong, you have to start out on tutorials. That's how you learn, right? But what you may find yourself falling into is just tutorial after tutorial after tutorial. You've been doing that for 6 months and you haven't built anything on your own. When I decided to build my own app, my own idea, where I couldn't just follow a recipe of a tutorial, like a to-do list of paint by numbers, my learning skyrocketed. You know, I was forced to take the ideas in my head and make them happen on an app, right? I wasn't following somebody else's instructions. So I had to dive into the documentation, or maybe I did follow a tutorial, but I could only take bits and pieces from it because it wasn't, exactly what I needed. If you find yourself in this tutorial trap and feel stuck, like you can't build anything on your own, you have to follow a tutorial, the only way out of that is to start building stuff on your own. It's going to be rough at first, but trust me, your learning will go through the roof. My next piece of advice would be to not worry about memorizing things. It doesn't matter how senior of a developer you are, you're probably going to Google the simplest of things each and every day. Like, it just happens to all of us. The key here is to know where to look for it, where to find the information you want, whether that's documentation, a certain blog post, etc. People starting out have this misconception that senior developers just sit in front of their computer, just type away, for an hour without looking something up. They just do it all from their head. That is absolutely not the case. I mentioned table views earlier, even though, sure, I can create the pretty typical standard table view, but if you do anything with like dynamic cell height or maybe section headers, that kind of stuff, I'm gonna be like, oh, I can't remember how to do that exactly. Let me look that up real quick. Again, you have this misconception that we just sit there and just type away for hours, never looking anything up. Couldn't be further from the truth. So the key here is to kind of learn how to learn and then also know where to find this stuff. Don't worry about memorizing. Next up, I want to talk about finding a mentor. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in person. If you live in a remote place where there's not a lot of developers, it can be online via Twitter, etc., or online coaching. I know when I first started out, I didn't really have this for the first year of my career. And when I got stuck, I'd be stuck for days. And it was, not only did it slow me down, but it was discouraging, right? Nobody likes to be stuck for days on a simple problem when you can reach out to a mentor and just say, hey, can you explain closures to me real quick? I say that because closures hang up a lot of people. And then having somebody, a mentor, explain that to you can help get you over that hurdle and back on your way. Again, that'll speed you up and you'll spend less time being discouraged, which the more time you spend being discouraged, the more likely you are to quit and not complete this journey of becoming a software developer. My next piece of advice is I would start diving into the documentation of not only your language, but the platform, whichever you're working on, iOS, web, Android, whatever, as soon as possible. Kind of like I said before, many of us start off doing tutorials and that's how we start learning. But like I said, once you can be self-sufficient and not rely on a cookie cutter tutorial, you can say, hey, I want to build this certain aspect. And then you go to the documentation around, that aspect of the platform. You can dig in and you can figure it out for your own. Now you're self-sufficient and that's how you really get things done. That's how you get out of that tutorial trap that I mentioned earlier. And now you're on your own, building your own ideas and you're on your way. So the documentation, I know, can be a little daunting, especially in the iOS Swift world. It's not exactly straightforward. And I get tons of requests for, hey, can you do a video on how to read the documentation? But I've thought about how I would do this, but truthfully, it's one of those things where you just got to dive in and it sucks, but it just gets better and easier over time. You kind of got to go through that learning curve. Fortunately, there's no magic bullet here, but just dive in as soon as possible and you'll get through that rough patch and be out the other side faster than you know it. The next advice is that you have to love it. Luckily, I do love it, but I talk to a lot of beginner programmers who are inexperienced or just getting started, and truthfully, they do it for the money, right? We all know software developers get paid pretty well, and that's the only reason they do it. They don't do it because they love to solve problems, or they don't do it because they love to build or create things, right? That's the reason you should be doing it, is because you love the fact that you can take an idea in your head, type on a keyboard with those colored text back there, and then something magical pops up on a phone. Like, if that is just so enticing to you, you're in it for the right reasons. And again, you just have to love this because, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you're going to run into rough patches. You're going to hit roadblocks. And if you don't love it, those roadblocks are going to knock you down and you're probably going to give up. However, if you love it, you're going to kind of take those challenges head on, plow through those roadblocks and be on your way. And newsflash, those roadblocks don't go away. Doesn't matter how senior you are or how long you've been doing this, technology's always changing. Something new is going to come out. ARKit, AR glasses, VR, whatever. And you're going to have to learn all over again. So if you don't love the process of learning and solving problems and building and creating, it's going to be a rough road. So again, you have to love this. Building on that, because I just kind of talked about how rough it can be, but it does get easier. And here's why. As you go through your career, like, it's going to seem super daunting that, there's all these possibilities of apps you can build. However, as you go through your career, whether it's contracting, working at other companies, you're going to be building various different apps. And when you build these apps, you're going to have these code bases on your hard drive. So you'll have access to previous code you've written to use in future projects. Now, I'm not saying you're just going to copy and paste that code, but let's say you built a fully fleshed out custom camera screen, and then 2 years later, you're going to build another camera app and you're like, oh, I've done that before. Let me go back. And again, you're not going to copy and paste it, but you're going to have a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done for you. So what I have found, I've built probably now 10 production apps between contracting and startups. Over time, I have built many, many features that can be done on an iPhone. So whenever I come across something, tricky, I know that I can always go back to, I call it my toolbox. I can always go back to my toolbox of code, see what I've done before and pull from there. And again, a lot of times the heavy lifting has been done and I just got to tweak it or add some little stuff. So it does get easier the longer you do it. And then, as always, I want to preach patience. Again, so many people reach out to me and say, how can I become an iOS developer as fast as possible? And right away, like, you already have the wrong mindset. Like, this is such a marathon. It's not a sprint. It is a very, very long journey. And if you're just trying to get there as fast as possible, all the other stuff I talked about earlier in the video is really going to come and bite you in the ass. So just be patient and don't compare yourself to somebody else as well. Like, this happens to me sometimes, right? I've been doing this for about 4 years and I look at developers who've been doing it for like 8 and I'm like, oh man, I'm not as good as them. It's like, they've been doing it twice as long as you. So it's hard to compare yourself to other developers. You're on your own journey. It's going to take a while. And like I said before, if you love it, you're determined, you're going to get there. Just keep plugging away, but just patience is the key. If software development was so easy that you could learn it in 2 months, everybody would be doing it. The market would be oversaturated and it wouldn't be such a coveted position. So have patience. It'll pay off in the long run. And then finally, probably my most important piece of advice, I've said this time and time again, get involved in Twitter ASAP. It took me 2 years to finally start interacting in iOS conversations on Twitter, and I just kick myself all the time. This sounds like a bold statement, but I would say Twitter is the most important tool for my developer career. Just the people I've met, the developers at other companies I've gotten to know and meet through Twitter, it's amazing. And I can really only speak for the Swift community, but the iOS and Swift community is amazing on Twitter, super helpful. I know Twitter may have a bad rap for some of you, but Twitter has like a lot of different types, right? Like there's sports Twitter, financial Twitter, software developer Twitter, at least in the Swift world, is amazing. Obviously, like political Twitter is probably a cesspool, but developer Twitter, great. This is a big part of how networking is done in the software developer world. You interact on Twitter. Next thing you know, you meet somebody at a conference and they know you because you've been interacting on Twitter. Anyway, I could go on for days, and I did in this video. Check it out. Twitter is so valuable for a developer, and I wasted 2 years being scared to jump into a conversation. Don't do that. Start right away, and you'll be happy you did.
Whether a dev bootcamp is worth it or not is actually a very easy question in my opinion. It's just a very personal one, and there's no one right answer for everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about why it could be worth it for you, and then why it might not be. Some quick context, I myself graduated from an 8-week in-person iOS developer bootcamp in San Francisco back in 2015. And within 2 months of graduation, I got my first full-time iOS developer job at a startup in Silicon Valley. So I had a great experience with the bootcamp. But I'm also seeing the other side of it. Now with this YouTube channel and the courses I create, I can see where foregoing the bootcamp and going the self-learner route is also viable. Here's the deal. Bootcamps teach basic intro-level beginner content, and that's great. Like, that's part of their pitch, right? They say go from no experience to employed developer in X amount of weeks, right? That's their purpose. But that beginner intro-level content is all over YouTube. And if you want to go deeper than that, content creators like myself, we usually have courses or coaching. Yes, that is a little bit of a cost, but that is going to pale in comparison to the thousands of dollars, maybe even $10,000 or more for a bootcamp. So when it comes to the actual educational content, right, like the stuff you learn, I would say all that money for a bootcamp is not worth it. Because like I said, most of it's free on YouTube or in relatively cheap courses. So if you're a highly motivated, self-starter, very disciplined, I would say no, don't go the bootcamp route. Save all that money, you're gonna be way better off. However, dedicating all those hours each day, day in and day out, over an extended period of time, is a lot easier said than done. I liken it to, people who say, you know what, I'm gonna get up every day at 5 a.m., I'm gonna go to the gym, I'm gonna work out. And it's like, are you? Are you? No, you're not, stop. And don't get me wrong, some people will, but of the 100 people that say they're gonna get up early and go to the gym, maybe 5 to 10 actually do it and stick with it for longer than a week or two. That's a good analogy for going the self-starter route versus a boot camp. So that's where I think a boot camp can be valuable. If you know yourself, you have the self-awareness to know that, hey, I need or want that structure of a boot camp, of knowing I gotta be somewhere, whether it's online or in person, every day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, right? You want that structure. A bootcamp can be very valuable for that. Another benefit of the bootcamp is the other developers you'll meet, and you'll learn how to work with developers, whether that's pair programming, code review, source control with GitHub. Learning how to play nice with other developers is a huge and valuable skill that you're just not gonna get if you go the self-starter route. And meeting these new developers is the very beginnings of your developer network, which is super important for your career. For example, 2 of my 8 classmates in my bootcamp ended up at Apple a couple years later, and another ended up at Coinbase in 2016. So even though they're just your peers now, they're students now, they're just learning with you, they're all gonna have their own careers. Who knows where they're gonna end up? So if you build this network, foster those relationships, it's highly likely that you're gonna know developers at major companies. The larger number of developers you know, the more people you're gonna know at companies that could potentially refer you to a job, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And these other developer students that you meet in your bootcamp are the very beginnings of your developer network. So if you're the type of person that wants or needs that structure, you like the idea of meeting and working with other developers and the high cost, because again, it's gonna be a few thousand, maybe 10,000 plus, or maybe it's an ISA, an income share agreement, where if you get hired, they're taking a percentage of your salary, for a while. Either way, it's expensive. So if that cost doesn't set you back, you like working with developers, you want the structure, I would say Dev Bootcamp is absolutely the way to go for you. Now, I just spent some time talking about the benefits of the network you'll get from your bootcamp. However, you can recreate that with some effort if you forego the bootcamp and go the self-starter route. The best place to do that as a self-starter developer is Twitter. Now, every time I bring this up, I always get pushback. Twitter's a cesspool, it's garbage. I can't believe you would recommend that to developers. You're wrong. Like, Twitter's a tool just like anything else. Here's the simple solution to that cesspool garbage of Twitter problem. Create an account that only follows developers in your industry or people in your industry. And if any of that political garbage or anything you don't want to see starts creeping into your feed, unfollow those people and replace them with people that are putting out developer knowledge. In fact, I did a whole video about networking on Twitter as developers. I'll put a link in the description, but highly recommend checking that out if you're thinking about going the self-starter route. Another way is community events. Whatever platform you're building for or language you're learning, there's a community around it. Again, most likely you'll find them on Twitter. Just using iOS developers as an example, because that's the community I'm in, they have an iOS Dev Happy Hour, where every few weeks it's a giant Zoom call, but they break it up into breakout rooms to where it's a smaller Zoom call so you can get to know developers on an individual level, because I know the idea of a giant Zoom call is horrible. Yeah, there's breakout rooms. But anyway, that's a great opportunity to meet people in the community, network, meet people at other companies. So even though this happy hour concept may not be a thing in other communities, there are other gatherings, other ways to meet developers online. Another suggestion for that would be content creators, right? You're watching this video, I'm sure you watch other content creators in your developer space. A lot of them have, communities, Slack channels, Discords, whatever. Join those, meet other developers. And then the last way I'll recommend, depends on your city, but like meetup.com. A lot of times there's developer meetups. And if you're not in a big city, maybe there's just a tech and startup meetup. My point is that there's plenty of ways to build your network if you forego the bootcamp and decide to go the self-starter route. Just takes a little bit of effort. So if you're highly motivated, very disciplined, then no, a bootcamp is not worth it for you. Save the money. Like I said, all the information is out there on YouTube or relatively cheap courses. However, it's easier said than done to stay disciplined and motivated for that long period of time. So if you feel like you need the structure and you like the idea of meeting and working with other developers and the cost of it doesn't set you back too much, then yeah, I think a bootcamp is a great way to go for you.
When it comes to my technical skills, I'm an average developer. Like if there was a normal distribution bell curve, I'd be parked right at the top of that thing, right? I'm not great, nothing special, but I'm not bad either. Just average. However, I think I'm a really good developer overall. However, I think there's a misconception out there, I don't know, probably because I create content and put out a lot of stuff, that I just know so much. And again, this is the misconception that I want to dispel, right? Because I get DMs, emails, comments on YouTube asking like very specific questions about all kinds of frameworks. And then as you know, like there's a whole ocean of knowledge that you can have. Like it's impossible to know everything about everything. The more experience I gain, the more I realize that like I don't know much. And there's a difference between knowing something, like having it memorized, versus being able to figure things out quickly and being a quick learner. I know a lot of you out there are probably just learning software development or just learning Swift, or you're earlier in your career, and you're probably very self-conscious about your knowledge, right? You probably look at these developers on Twitter or content creators and you think to yourself like, wow, I don't know nearly as much as they do. And you're self-conscious about your knowledge. Well, again, I want to say that like, you don't have to know much, but there's a couple keys. Even if your knowledge is mediocre or less, there's some things you can do as a developer to make yourself really, really good. And I alluded to one of those just a little bit ago, and that is your ability to learn. Like I said, I don't know much off the top of my head, like UIKit, for example. I don't know anything about that. However, I'm confident if I were to get tasked with building an AR app, like I would dive into the documentation, I would read books. Like I'm very confident that I would be able to pick up that knowledge and skill set relatively quickly. And I think that's the big thing, is learning how to learn. Whether you learn by reading books or watching videos or diving into documentation or listening to podcasts, like figure out how you learn, because the ability to pick up new skills and new knowledge relatively quickly is a huge part of being a developer. You don't have to have every framework out there memorized. And besides learning how to pick things up quickly, there's a whole slew of soft skills that I believe are at least half of the equation, right? There's your technical skills and then there's your soft skills. And that's where, even though I say my technical skills are average, I believe my soft skills are way, way, way above average. And that's what I think makes me a good developer overall, even though my technical skills, like I said, they're fine, they're average. And those are skills that you can work on, right? Like your communication skills, like having the ability to break down complex technical topics, not only to maybe more junior developers or other technical people, but other non-technical people at your company or on your team. For example, I spend a lot of time in small startups, so I'm constantly having to communicate to, the CEO, the trade-offs between how complex we want to make this feature, right? Because what happens with, marketing and product people or co-founders, like they want to add features. Well, it's up to you as a developer to properly communicate like, hey, that's fine. We can add this feature, but we're either going to have to get rid of another feature or make some trade-offs because we have a launch date that we got to hit. And if we keep adding features, like we're going to miss that launch date. And properly communicating that and having those discussions is an insanely valuable skill for a developer. And of course, the number one thing you can control is your work ethic, right? You can just be a hard worker. Back to that ability to pick things up quickly, diving into books, learning new things, like that work ethic and that drive, like you can control that. You can improve on that. And then other soft skills like the passion you have for your job and your craft. Also being a good teammate. It doesn't matter how great of a developer you are. If you're a horrible teammate and you're a horrible person, you're bad to work with, you're going to be a net negative on your overall team, no matter how good your skills are. Another soft skill you can work on is showing initiative, right? Don't always wait and sit back and be told what to do. Now, I'm not saying go rogue, but if you're a junior developer, like go to your senior developers or go to your team and say, hey, I had this idea. I want to research it. I want to look into building this. What do you think? And showing the initiative will go a long way. And then of course you can start researching UI, UX, design, overall product stuff, right? We're talking about making up for a lack of technical knowledge. Well, again, there's a lot more that goes into being a developer than just knowing the code, right? Understanding, like I said, the UI, UX, the product, design, like start studying that, start getting very, very good at that. Because again, that makes you more well-rounded. Today we're going to talk about a software development concept that really only sinks in once you have experience. And there's not really an official name for it, but I call it the 90-90 rule. Now again, this will usually only bite you in the ass as a new developer when you're building your first app or your first product. And that is the concept that there's the first 90% of the app, and then there's the second 90% of the app. And you're thinking, wait a minute, 180%? What are you talking about? Like, what the hell does that mean? We'll talk about it. So here's typically what happens when you're building your first app, first website, first software development product. You're going to build that core functionality first. So when you have all that done, the app is going to feel like it's 90% done. You're going to be able to play with it, do all the main functions that you want, and it's going to be like, wow, this app's ready to go almost. Just, it's 90% done. Just got a little bit of polish to go, and we're done. Ship it. But that's where you'd be wrong. You see, that was just the first 90%. And even though it feels almost done, you're really only about halfway done. And that's where the second 90% comes in. And that's all this little stuff where each thing on its own doesn't really seem like that big a deal, but they all add up to a lot of work actually. And that's why when you get to that first 90% point, you're really only halfway done. And the reason I want to talk about this and bring this up to you newer developers is that it can be very discouraging. I remember building my first app. It was discouraging as hell. It was frustrating. Like I felt like I was almost done. This thing's ready to ship. And then it's just all this little stuff just keeps piling up. And we're going to talk about that little stuff later. But I wanted to share this concept so you know this going into building your first app, or if you're already midway through, you can kind of expect this. Because what happens is, again, once you get that first 90% done, you think you're done or close to being done, and then you just get smacked in the face by the second 90%. So I'm trying to forewarn you and let you know that second 90% is coming. So let's talk about that second 90% that's about to smack you in the face, and we'll talk about some of the things that it can typically be. Now, if you're here watching this and you're not an iOS developer, that's what my channel focuses on, is Swift and iOS development. So these examples are going to be from that perspective, but you can apply it, to your own process. But let's talk about edge cases here. Now, this can be anything from how does your app perform when there's, no internet or very, very poor internet connection, right? You got to handle all of that. What happens when a user gets a brand new device? Are you relying on storing some stuff in user defaults too much? Or, if they delete the app and reinstall, is your app still going to behave properly? Or things like, what happens when a user kills your app in the middle of a key, function that's going on? Or is your app going to be able to recover from that gracefully? Or is it just going to be in this weird state that's broken, right? So you see, basically what really happens here is you think you know how users are going to use your app, but really once it gets out in the wild and users start, banging on your app, they're going to do things you could never even think of. So all these edge cases, you have to try and think of that in advance. And like I said, these small things really add up and do some time-consuming, fixes. And those were just some common general edge cases. These edge cases are going to be very specific to your app, but they really add up. Next up, let's talk about some really robust error handling, right? When we're initially developing our app, how common is it to be like, handle the errors, and you'll do that later, right? Because it's tedious work, because you got to handle all the various different error messages and fail gracefully like we do in our apps, right? You don't want to just have an abrupt error that's not descriptive. You want to let the user know what's going on so they know what happened with your app and so forth. So building out really robust error handling is tedious and time consuming, but it has to be done. And again, it's one of those things where on its own, it may not seem that bad, but when you pile on error handling with edge cases and all the other stuff we're going to talk about, again, you can start to see where this second 90%, again, it adds up. And then you have things like just overall analytics, right? You want to see how many times users are going to a specific screen or how many times they're doing a specific function. So now you gotta, once the app's done, you gotta, put in your analytics so you can track everything. And then there's accessibility features for people with disabilities. And this is often overlooked by many developers, but it's so important. I've covered it on Swift News a few times. Just the percentage of people that, use the iPhone that actually use these accessibility features. It's a big deal. And if you're ignoring accessibility, stop, you shouldn't. And then you got testing your UI on all the many device sizes here in the iOS ecosystem. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're using auto layout correctly, that's going to handle 80 to 90% of the work in my opinion. However, making your app look beautiful on the iPhone XS Max, yes I said XS, and then down to the iPhone SE size, like that's a massive difference. And like I said, a lot of times auto layout will do most of the work, but most of the time you got to tweak that final 10% to get it really looking perfect on both screens. And like I said in the beginning, when you're building the original functionality of your app going through the first time, you're not worried about making it look great on all screen sizes while you're still building it and trying to get it to work, right? You kind of save that for the end once you're ready for the polish. But again, now we're just piling more stuff up onto that second 90% that we're talking about. And then there's the good old refactoring. How many times have you built a feature, to refactor this later when you have more time, right? Because oftentimes in software development, you just hack it together to get it working, and then you clean it up later. Well, sometimes, depending on any deadlines, you might not get to that cleanup, which, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that. That's bad. Always try to refactor it and make your code, good before, moving on to the next thing. But I know shit happens, and sometimes you don't have the chance to do that. But eventually you got to pay the piper, and again, during the second 90% is usually when you clean up a lot of technical debt and do a lot of refactoring. And then there's testing. Depending on your philosophy, if you're doing test-driven development, then you're doing the test first, so this won't be in the second 90%. But most people don't do test-driven development. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying the majority of developers don't do that. So now your unit tests come in after you've built the app. So again, more stuff in the second 90%. So those were just some examples of what can be in that second 90% that just comes in and smack you in the face. But I wanted to share this because the main takeaway I want you to take away from this video is know that second 90% is coming, and don't be blindsided by it, and don't get discouraged. If you're building your very first app, or if you're a junior developer, I want to get you in the right mindset to expect a whole lot of work to still be needed to be done when you think you're almost done. Again, there's the first 90% and the second 90%. A little over 5 years ago, I was just like you. I was trying to learn how to code just by watching online videos, taking online courses. And I wrote my first line of code at 32 years old, had no prior programming experience, just wanted to do a career change and was interested in this. I had no prior programming experience, and I've done very well for myself. And I don't say that to brag. Again, the point of this video is to show you, somebody that was in your shoes and that has done it. So like I said, I've been an iOS engineer for about 5 years now, just about all of which was spent in San Francisco in Silicon Valley. How I got interested in all this is I was working for a startup out there as a growth lead, sales type stuff, and I just became friends with our engineers because it was a small team, small startup, and started asking questions about what they were doing and just about coding in general. And to be honest with you, and I hope this doesn't come off as arrogant, but after getting to know them and seeing what they did, I was like, I'm just as smart as them. There's no reason I can't do that. So I started exploring, started Googling, doing online videos, YouTube, buying online courses. Again, I was exactly where you are right now. So when I started learning, it was early 2015. By summer of 2015, I did an iOS developer bootcamp. Now I know what you may be thinking. Well, bootcamp is great. That's what gave you that head start. But now that I've done the bootcamp and I've created tutorials, like you just learn the very basics in the bootcamp. Like everything I learned in the bootcamp is in like super beginner online YouTube videos, right? The benefit of the bootcamp for me was forcing myself to work on it for 8 hours a day, right? Because you got to be there for 2 months, 8 hours. So that was the huge benefit of the bootcamp. Not I got crazy good knowledge or crazy good teachers. It just forced me to do it. But my bootcamp was a good experience. I liked the people I graduated with. We ended up building an app called Fit Hero, which I really, really like. You're seeing some screens of that. Thought it was pretty cool. And about a month and a half after the bootcamp, I got hired at my first real iOS developer job. So now we're talking November 2015 at a company called Breathometer. They were on Shark Tank. They were the first company to get all 5 sharks to invest. I think they got like $1 million investment. This was back in 2013. That was a pretty big deal for the time. But I got that job not for my developer skills, and I'll tell a quick story. So I basically did the phone screen interview, failed miserably, did horrible. And I found out later, they're like, yeah, we put you in the no pile, like we were already moving on. But what I did was I showed a little bit of initiative. I emailed them and said, hey, look, I know I didn't do well on that. Do you have a take-home project that I could do, something I could work on that I can really showcase my skills? Because I know as somebody without a CS degree and just a bootcamp grad, I know I have to prove myself even more. So I would love to do a take-home project and show you what I can do. That was basically the email. And they said, sure. And long story short, I did the project, they loved it, and I got hired. So I guess the tip there is don't be afraid to show some initiative. But anyway, I got hired there, again, in San Francisco, and I was making $60,000, which again, when you talk about salary, that is different all over the world. I get it. But for San Francisco, right, Silicon Valley, $60,000 for an engineer is like well below minimum wage. But I took it because, again, I had applied to 60 companies. I wasn't getting any jobs. Like it was rough getting that first job. So I was like, I just need somebody to take a chance on me. I know I can get in there, prove myself, and I'll ask for a raise in like 6 months. Like that was my plan. Like, because I knew I would get in there and perform. Like I had confidence in myself. And within a month and a half of working there, my VP of software, my boss, kind of pulled me aside and was like, I'm working on a raise for you. Like you deserve it. We need to pay you the just market rate. It wasn't like I was getting superstar money, but just market rate, because 60,000 was not market rate. Long story short, like a Series A funding, like delayed it and delayed it and delayed it. Anyway, I ended up getting 100K by May of 2016. So I'm 6 months in to my first ever job and I crossed the 6-figure mark. So I worked at Berthometer for about a year and a half, and then I left there to start interviewing at some of the major companies in Silicon Valley, right? The Facebooks, the Apples, the Googles. Naively, I thought I was ready, right? After just a year and a half of basically on-the-job training, I thought I was ready. So I went out and did all those interviews. I got my butt kicked, basically just failed all those interviews. It was a great experience, and I did get interviews at all these companies, but when I got to a final interview or a whiteboarding session, I got my butt kicked. But it was a good rude awakening, and it actually led to the creation of my YouTube channel that many of you are probably familiar with, because I wanted to show my knowledge. Rather than wait on an interview, I wanted to just put all my knowledge out there by making videos, become a well-known name in the space, and that was kind of the whole point of the YouTube channel. But during this time of me getting my butt kicked at interviews, I picked up some contracts on the side because I had quit Berthometer. I wasn't working. I was focused solely on interviews. And as I'm getting my butt kicked in the interviews, I started picking up more and more contracts and was like, you know what? Let me try contracting, right? I got enough to support me. So for the next year and a half, I did independent contracting, which was great. I say that was like the time where I learned the most, because in independent contracting, I bounced around from project to project like every 3 or 4 months. So I got a lot of experience and a lot of exposure to different code bases, different types of apps, etc. So that's when my learning really skyrocketed. And again, at that point, I'm already a year and a half into my career before my learning skyrocketed. So just keep that in mind. So after working remotely by myself for about a year and a half, quite frankly, I started getting bored and lonely. Like I never left my apartment. So I was yearning to get back on a team. So in April of 2018, I joined Luna, which was great because I got the opportunity to build a product and build the app from scratch. And it had like a video game element to it. So it was kind of building like, the economy of the game. Should we implement daily quests? So that was a ton of fun. And I worked there full time up until July of 2019. I'm still there to this day in more of a part-time consultancy role because I'm there to like help them make sure the app launches correctly and smoothly, but I'm not there full time anymore. Now I left Luna back in July of 2019 because I wanted to do one of two things, right? I was kind of at like a crossroads in my career. Because I'd spent all my time either independent contracting or at small startups, I never got that experience at a big company like the Googles, the Facebooks, Apples, etc. So I really thought I wanted that on my resume. And it's not that I wanted to work at a big company, like I wanted the clout, the prestige, if you will, of having that on my resume so that could potentially open up doors for my future. So looking back on it, I kind of wanted to work there for the wrong reasons. Long story short, I could either go big company or pursue this YouTube thing full time because I've been building this YouTube channel, at this time for like 2.5 years. It was growing well. I could see the business opportunity there. So my choice was big company, do my own thing. And I was actually in pretty serious talks with PayPal. I was in the interview process with Twitch. And right in the middle of all that, I decided I'm going to pursue my own thing and do this YouTube thing full time. So that was back in August of 2019. I made the full-time leap and here we are, right? The YouTube channel is going very well. I'm putting out courses for the community, creating all kinds of content for the community. I'm very happy with my decision, right? I work for myself. I get to work on fun projects, whatever I think will help my YouTube business. It's just a blast. So I was able to take this skill that I learned, this iOS development, building products, and parlay that over 5 years into now working for myself. Again, the biggest benefit of that is I get to work on what I want to work on, right? If I have a cool idea, I work on it. And as of March of 2020, it has already surpassed my Silicon Valley developer salary, and we're still just getting started. So I wanted to share my story just to show you how great this career is and this skill is and all the flexibility and the things you can do. Like the multiple career paths you can take with this skill, it's just amazing. In fact, I got a whole video later in the course talking about all the different paths you can take to really, fit your lifestyle. So that's my story. And again, I wanted to share that to hopefully inspire you. Of course, you're not going to follow my path directly. You're going to create your own path. But the beauty is you have so many options. That path can take you so many different places. A couple weeks ago, I put out this tweet because I wanted to make sure I was covering everything in my beginner course. However, as you can see, it got over 500 responses, went a little viral. I did not expect that, but some of the answers in this tweet are awesome and I want to share that with you. So let's talk about this tweet. I said, when you were first exposed to the world of iOS development, what was a basic thing that confused you? Anything with Xcode, Swift, etc. And, my example was I didn't realize the UI in front of UI button and UI label meant that that was part of UIKit. Like I was importing UIKit, I didn't know what that meant. So I was hoping people would share, kind of embarrassing things that they stumbled upon as a beginner, because I know many beginners watch my channel and they may be frustrated or struggling on basic concepts. And the point of this video is to say, hey, look, we all started somewhere. We're gonna go through these pretty rapid fire, but we'll start with something I'm sure you can relate with, and that is auto layout. Here it says auto layout. Man, I remember learning it as constraining to a container, to another container. I could just never wrap my head around that concept. The only time I understood it properly when I actually started using auto layout regularly in storyboards, and here's the key why I wanted to feature Ollie's tweet. Experience greater than education, right? You can't just watch one tutorial and expect to know it. Like many of us developers that are experienced and that know things, we know it because we've done it 100 times, or we spent 2 hours debugging this one thing. So like he says, experience is greater than education. Repetition is the key. And then also Jordana, adding on to that, Jordana is an engineering manager at Netflix. And by the way, you're going to hear me like name drop some companies. That is only to let you know that, even developers at very big companies, very experienced, all started somewhere. So again, Jordana had trouble with auto layout. She says at the time it seemed more convoluted than CSS layouts. And here we have Paul Hudson, who I'm sure many of you know, says, I still have the code from my first project. It was made on a train without the internet while he was learning Objective-C as he went. Says he thought he had to have zibs for all screens. And this was what made me laugh here. He says, I often broke outlets, and in order to fix that, he just rolled back the code to undo. So I thought that was pretty funny. And then here we have Lena with probably the most common tweet. Again, over 500 replies. I can't feature them all, but delegates was probably the most common. So if you're struggling with delegates, just know that we pretty much all did. Next, we have Adam, who's an iOS engineer at Nike, with another common one, and that is closures. He says, I still periodically screw up the syntax, and I've written thousands of them. And I can add on to that. If I'm creating a long closure, I almost never type it out from scratch with add escaping and whatever parameters and whatever you're returning. I pretty much always find an old closure, copy and paste, and then edit, right? Because trying to write that brand new from scratch, I don't have that in my head. And as you can imagine, you may be struggling with it too. Closures was another very common answer in the tweet thread. Now we have Boz, who's the author of Swift Weekly Brief, a newsletter that follows the evolution of Swift. If you're not subscribed to that, you should be. But it says it all started somewhere back in 2012 or 2013 with Big Nerd Ranch's Objective-C book. He said he remembers building a bright colored view controller with a button that would show after an alert was tapped. Very, very basic. But here's why I wanted to feature his tweet, because again, this is probably very relatable to a lot of you. It says, a roller coaster from there. I understand it. No, I don't understand it. I understand it. No, I don't. And that pretty much sums up your whole development career as you learn new things, because you never stop learning no matter how senior you are. And it is a roller coaster. And with the release of SwiftUI, that's a great example. Now, not all of us, of course, but many of us are new to declarative programming. So learning SwiftUI is kind of going back to being a beginner again. So again, we're back on that roller coaster. Now we have Rebecca Slackin with one word, sums it up nicely. Provisioning. Even experienced developers still have nightmares about provisioning, because oftentimes you set up all the provisioning profiles, certificates, and all that stuff, entitlements. You usually set that up at the beginning of a project, and then you're done for the most part. So after you fumble your way through that, you don't have to do it again until you start a new project, which for some people could be years. So yes, provisioning, if you're struggling with that, that still trips up even experienced developers. And Jen K made me laugh with this one, because I know I've been there. I'm sure many of you have been there, but breakpoints. She set a breakpoint, had no idea why her program kept stopping. Well, if you don't know what a breakpoint is, you set a breakpoint to tell your program to stop so you can debug. And I know I've been there thinking my app was crashing for some reason and having a little mini panic attack, and then, oh no, I just had a breakpoint somewhere. Next, we have Dave Verwer, author of iOS Dev Weekly, another great newsletter. Go sign up to that if you're not. It says, I remember reading the paragraph in the docs that covered auto release about 20 times and still not really understanding when or why I'd use it. Now, if you're new and you're wondering what auto release is, don't worry about it. That predates me even. That's an Objective-C memory management thing. But the reason I still wanted to share this was because Dave talks about how he went and read the documentation 20 times and still didn't get it. So I know many beginners get frustrated after they maybe watch one tutorial or maybe read the documentation once and then they get frustrated. A lot of things will take multiple reads and multiple practice with to finally get it. And Dave's tweet illustrates that. And now we have Chris Wilson with another very common confusion point, if you will, is the functions like view did load, view will appear, view did appear. Normally you're used to writing a function and then you have to call that function manually. Well, these ones get called by the system. So that is often confusing. Many beginners are like, well, Where do I call view to load? Where do I do this? Well, the system calls that. Now, this was another very common answer, and I remember being confused about this myself. Here we have Mark Zakaria, engineering manager at Twitch, says, that was 10 years ago, so forgive this egregious one. That's the whole point, Mark. This is supposed to be the embarrassing ones, right? Views versus view controllers. And I'm still even guilty, even in some of my tutorial videos, of saying view when I meant view controller. And again, that's just an artifact of a bad habit I had that when I was confusing views and view controllers. So another very common confusion. And I know Mark, and I know he's really into StarCraft 2, and he's a Protoss main, so I had to fire back with a nice little joke answer saying it's simple. It's like a carrier, right? A view controller can hold and control a bunch of views. I guess you have to play StarCraft to get that joke. But moving on, we have Keith Moon said, I had been a professional iOS developer for a year before I realized you could create your own protocols. In those early days, I was very much faking it until I can make it. I kind of did the same thing. I've said this before in my story that I got hired at my first developer job, not for my existing developer skills, because I was fresh out of a boot camp. They just, like me, my attitude, my work ethic, and had confidence that I would learn it. But my first year of the job was basically on-the-job training. And I've said many times before, like, I didn't really understand delegates and protocol pattern until like a year into my career. It sounds like Keith had the same thing with declaring your own protocols. Next, we have Bashir Al-Mallah, passing data. That was another very, very common answer, but I like how he described his initial solution, which was kind of funny, right? He says, passing data between view controllers in SpriteKit scenes was something I struggled with a lot. His solution, in quotes, was to just use global variables everywhere, so everything had access to his variables, right? You don't got to pass the data if everybody can access it. So I thought that was funny. But again, passing data was a very, very common answer to this. Moving on to Chris Eidoff of objc.io, author of many, many great books all about Swift and iOS development. You can check them out. But how to best organize my code. Even in my very first project, the view controllers were way too large. And that was another common answer, the whole massive view controller, right? A lot of people, when they start, they just do everything in one view controller. And then eventually you'll learn how to like break things out and compartmentalize. But again, another common mistake. So if you're making that one, still try to fix it, but just know that a lot of people started out doing that. Another one that I used to be very guilty of from Shahab or Jay Penguin, optionals. I used to force unwrap all the things without realizing like that's why you had so many crashes in your app. So again, a lot of beginners will start off like not fully understanding when and how to unwrap your optionals. So you just say, whatever, Xcode's telling me to force unwrap, because it used to be like the fix it in Xcode where you would tap it and it would just force unwrap it for you. So I know a lot of people would do that just to get rid of the error. And it would end up, force unwrapping at the wrong time and crashing the app. So I used to be very guilty of that. Now we have JP Samard of Lyft and the Swift Unwrap podcast says, I remember first dragging images onto Interface Builder with Xcode 3, running it in the simulator, and now thinking, now what, right? I got my pixels onto the screen, but how do I make it work? And I remember that vividly, like, because I started off, just dragging and dropping stuff in Interface Builder. I could make the screen look like I wanted, and then I was like, okay, how do I make it work, right? So I remember that exact feeling vividly, just not in Xcode 3. I think I started in Xcode 6. But anyway, I'm sure we've all been there. Sticking with Interface Builder, I like this tweet. Interface Builder's structure, file owner, responder. Again, that predates even me, but Interface Builder used to be a separate app from Xcode, right? I know many of you new people may not remember that. Again, that predates my time as well. But here's a nice picture of it that I thought would be fun to share, how Interface Builder had a lot of floating screens. It was a separate app from Xcode. Rough times back in the day, rough times. Next, we have Jordan Morgan of Buffer and independent app developer of SpenStack, but he says that UIKit could only run on the main thread. And what exactly that meant, right? Main thread, background thread, what did that all mean? So threading was another common answer. And then we have Simon Rice with another common one, something I've addressed in a recent video, was probably seemingly random crashes that turned out to be IB outlets I forgot to hook up. So again, that is another common thing for beginners. You're creating all these outlets and actions, and then you're making changes, and then things get all out of whack and your app crashes. So I'm sure you've run into that before, but this was another super common answer. Now we have a fun one from Ken here, a little Apple history for you. He says, how might it be possible to type quickly and accurately on a touchscreen? So during the iPhone development, they were competing with BlackBerry and people could type real quickly on a physical keyboard. So how do you type quickly and accurately on a touchscreen? Because it was really tough. So if you don't know, what Ken and the team did was they would kind of predict what you were typing. For example, if you typed a T, it was very likely that you were going to type an H next. So they would make the hit target for the H key a lot bigger. And then if you type TH, now it was way more likely that you're going to have an E after that. So the E would be bigger. So It's not actually bigger on the screen, but just the actual touch target is bigger. So that allowed for quick, accurate typing using it was like predictive. So that was a fun answer. I enjoyed seeing Ken chime in here. And another one from back in the day, oh my God, what do you mean we can't discuss this in public? Like even with our coworkers, our friends, you can't publish books about it. So again, a little bit of a history. If you were working on iOS apps like before the App Store even launched, like you were part of like the launch process, you had to sign an NDA. You couldn't say anything about it. And then here we have Mario with one about navigation. Back in 2011, I decided to build my first app on iOS 4.3. I had no idea how to handle navigation. So the whole app was built in a single view where the elements were like hidden and shown based on the user state. And I always like hearing these stories about how people built these really, really weird apps because they didn't really fully understand it. They got it working, but definitely not the way it's supposed to be. And then finally, we have Alan Wickstead here. I was essentially terrified of all the build settings and such menus. I still don't know what I'm doing in there, but at least I'm not terrified. I'm a little terrified. like here, I'm putting it up on the screen. Like, I'm not gonna lie. If I'm digging in here and doing stuff, like I'm walking a tightrope. Like I'm usually following some tutorial or some Stack Overflow post. I don't know what I'm doing when I really, really dig into here. And I bet a lot of other people don't either. So if you don't understand all this stuff, like, don't worry. I bet a vast majority of developers feel the same way. So that's all the tweets. Again, to put up this tweet, the whole point of this video was to let you know that even experienced developers working at well-known companies, like we all started somewhere. We all have these embarrassing stories that we did at the beginning. This is targeted at you out there that is at the beginning. So hopefully this makes you feel a little bit better. We've all heard of imposter syndrome. We've probably all experienced imposter syndrome, but this video really stems from this tweet here from Alfonso that says, how do you gain confidence as a developer? I feel very confident in myself as a person, but as a developer, not so much at times. Now, the first two responses I want to touch on are from Zach and Corey. And Zach says, write code, then keep writing code. When you're finished writing, talk about code, then write some more code. It's all the process, the more you do it, etc. And the point Zach touches on that I want to elaborate on is just this concept of immersion that I always talk about with people like learning development. Just completely immerse yourself and soak up as much knowledge as you can, whether that's YouTube videos, books, podcasts, blogs, like just completely immerse yourself in this world. And the more you do that, just over time, like knowledge is power. You're just going to increase your knowledge just day by day by day by day. And just over time, like the more you know, the more confident you'll become. And then Corey says, for me, it's looking back at how I didn't know a single thing about code and now have an app in the App Store. I remind myself of the steps I've taken, even if they are small. I have to remind myself that in time I will get better and better. But if I quit, no progress. And that builds on what Zach says, and what I want to touch on is just the concept of patience. Yes, I mentioned immersion a little bit ago, but you can't just immerse yourself and 3 days later be confident in all your knowledge, right? It's going to take time. So just knowing in the back of your head that this is a long, multi-year journey, that might not, give you the confidence, but that will help you deal with that feeling of lack of confidence. Know that everybody started out, as a beginner at one point. So just know that this is your journey. It's going to take time. The next response here from David Cacho, it might be my favorite one because I think it resonates with me the most, and it says, the single best way to gain confidence is to acknowledge you won't know everything as a developer, but that you know where to find anything you don't know. This will get you through anything every time. And I always say the biggest thing as a developer is you need to learn how to learn, right? Because like David says, it's impossible to know everything about every development language or every framework within that language, etc. You just can't know that stuff. But if you know how to learn, that will boost your confidence, because like I know that's kind of where I'm at is, say I go to a company that works with ARKit and they're building an augmented reality app. I've never built an ARKit app, but I'm not worried about that because I know that I will, again, back to the first, responses, I would completely immerse myself, and given, a few weeks in time, I'll be caught up to speed and I'll be good to go. So the reason I have confidence there is because I know how to learn things, I'm confident in myself that I will pick it up quickly. So again, I would work on that skill if you want to build your confidence. Learning how to learn might be the most important skill as a developer. Next up, we have a good one from Andy Hope that says, I suggest avoiding comparing yourself to others. We're all at different positions in our journey. With enough perseverance, you will get to where you want to be in due time. Be humble with what you've learned, be proud, and be curious, and be you. So the message here is don't compare yourselves to others. Like, you're on your own path. There's a nice saying that I love. It's called, comparison is the thief of joy. Just do you, be on your own path, and don't worry about oh, this person knows more than I do. You don't know their history. You may be self-taught. You wrote your first line of code 3 years ago. They may have been coding since they were 12, right? That's not a fair comparison. So
don't compare yourself to other people. You're on your own journey. Next up, I want to talk about Mark Opont's response. You gain confidence by working around people that build you up and allow you to fail gracefully. Also build projects and build small, work on small tasks, etc. Really what I wanted to focus on with Mark's response is, gaining confidence by working around people that build you up and allow you to fail gracefully. Because really what I want to elaborate on is your environment is so important, right? Don't get me wrong, I know oftentimes if you're trying to get that first job, you may not have a lot of choices on where you go, but if you are fortunate enough to have any choice, my opinion is to always judge the quality of team first. Like a lot of people go for the biggest salary, and to me, salary is like third or fourth on the list of importance, and team is number one. Think about it. You work with these people every day, 8, 9, 10 hours, however long you work, whatever. You spend more time with them than you do your family. So your environment that you build is going to have a major effect on your confidence, your career, and just that vital, first year of your career, having a good team that really boosts you up and good mentors, that can just, shoot you off exponentially on an amazing career. Vice versa, if you're in a very toxic environment, that can just really depress you and put you down and can really affect the whole rest of your career. So again, I want to stress what Mark is saying here is your environment is super important, and that can really help with your confidence. Or even if you are a confident person and you go into a toxic environment, that can remove your confidence. So pay attention to your environment. Next up, we got a good response from Jordan here. It says, reflection. Look back on where you started and where you are now. Try to get 1% better every day. That's a very common saying. But basically what he says is just have context and perspective on how far you've actually come. This really resonates with me because I was a self-taught developer, 4 years ago, did a boot camp and have been on my way. But it's just anytime I was lacking confidence, it's like, man, you didn't even know how to code 4 years ago. Now look where you're at. It's good to keep that in perspective, how far you've actually come, and be like, yeah, I got this. And then, this is all building on previous answers. You're on your own journey. Don't compare yourself to others. And just, again, perspective is the big key here. You've come a long way. And the next comment I want to talk about is from Sky Brown. And she says, I think building something from the ground up by myself is a huge confidence builder. Being able to accomplish something independently and figure things out on my own makes me feel like a real developer. And this was a major turning point in my career and my confidence as well, as when I built my first app on my own. I think what a lot of people can fall into, especially when they're just learning how to code or just getting started, you fall into what I call the tutorial trap, where all you do is just build tutorials, follow everybody's instructions. Sure, you've built 3, 4, 5 apps, but they're not your apps. You just followed a recipe, so to speak, which, don't get me wrong, you have to do that in the beginning. That's how you learn. But what happens with people is they stay in that comfort zone way too long. And really what you should do to get out of that tutorial trap, think of your own app, think of your own idea, and build it on your own. Build it yourself. Don't get me wrong, you can look at references to help you build it, but you're not following a tutorial, you're building your own idea. And when I did that, I think my learning jumped up exponentially because a lot of stuff I was doing, there wasn't a specific tutorial for. So what did I have to do? I had to dig into the documentation. I had to figure out, and I'm not gonna lie, it was hard as hell. It took forever, took a long time. It was a struggle, but at the same time, I learned a ton doing it. And when I got out through the other side, my confidence level was just high because, again, like I talked about earlier, I started learning how to learn, and that's just a huge thing. And then finally, I want to end this on this one from Getify. He says, 20 plus years experience as a developer. He's got 8 books with over 100,000 copies sold, 300 hours of videos watched, 4,000 people taught in person. Very accomplished developer, right? And he says, and you know what? I still struggle to get my code to work, and it's still a tedious slog, and my code still confuses me the next day. What he's saying here is just, we all deal with this stuff. No matter how experienced you are, you're going to deal with this. And I really like what he says, though, because it resonates with me. I have 200 plus YouTube videos out there. I can't tell you how many times I refer to my own video to implement something relatively simple, right? Because like we mentioned earlier, it's impossible to memorize everything. You're not going to know, but if you know where to look and know where to figure it out, you're good. That's all you need to know.
Next up, we have How Necessary Are the Programming Fundamentals by Bruno Roca. And it's an interesting topic, right? We've all been there. It's been talked about on iOS developer Twitter all the time. How important are those data structures and algorithm skills, right? The whiteboard interviews you get at all the big companies for iOS developers, right? We've had that debate tons of times. Many iOS developers
don't like that that's what we get tested on. And this is a good article kind of showing the other side of things and helping you understand the complete picture. Because like I said, we'll go down to these common complaints that we see here. And I recommend reading the whole article. It is a little bit longer, so I'll kind of like jump around. But right here are the common complaints, right? We've seen this all the time. I've even complained about this a ton. So, we're not all immune to it, right? But, the questions don't reflect what the person will actually do on their job. They're not indicative of a person's skill in an iOS developer, right? Like my ability to do some crazy, matrix, 2D array problem doesn't really affect what I do as an iOS developer and building apps, right? So that's kind of the sentiment that a lot of iOS developers have, right? The questions in general are pointless. Why does an iOS developer need to know how sorting functions work, right? We've all been there. But Bruno here does a great job in this article of breaking down like why these larger companies like the Googles of the world focus on this so much. And I think he really breaks it down in this great analogy of becoming a professional musician. It's long. I won't go through it, but I'll kind of get to the highlight points he talks about here. So basically he talks about like when you're learning to be a musician, do you just need to learn the notes and the chords for your song, or do you need to understand like music theory and all that stuff? That's the analogy he uses for programming. And so he says, who really needs to learn the theory? So this is kind of like the deep computer science skills. And I think these 3 points really break it down into what you need to do and what you need to learn, right? And essentially, do I want to learn it as a hobby and never going beyond playing on my couch for fun? So this would, again, be like the hobbyist coder, right? I'm just going to tinker around, build a little app, cool. Then you probably don't need all the computer science fundamentals, right? Same thing. Do I want to play in a band and solidify myself as a musical artist? This would be the equivalent of an iOS developer going to a medium-sized company and just building the app, right? You're kind of, the joke with iOS development is like 90% of it is just hitting an API, parsing the JSON, making it look pretty on the screen, just doing pretty basic run-of-the-mill stuff. And you can make a great career out of that. That's not like knocking that at all. But for that, you probably don't need the computer, science theory. So again, where you do need it is, well, this is a long sentence, but he aspires to go beyond the mere title of a musical artist and be like a classical music, like a big deal. And how this ties into tech is, however, if you aspire to learn multiple platforms, work in a global tech company, amazing salaries, blah, 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 here's the line I like, who are at the top of their field, helping them literally define what tech is. Okay, if you're doing that, like, if you're at Tesla, creating self-driving cars, or if you're in the AR field and you're defining the AR tech, 1,000,000% you're going to need to know the fundamentals of computer science theory, like inside and out. That's where those are important. So again, the distinction here, you can't really put a whole blanket over everybody, right? What do you want to do? Are you just a hobbyist? Do you just want to work at a company where you're just building pretty standard iOS apps? Or do you want to define technology, right? So if you're in the first 2 camps, you probably don't need to understand all the computer science theory and all that stuff. And you can have great careers doing that. Again, not knocking it. However, if you want to go to these big companies and work on the cutting edge and define technology, then yes, the computer science fundamentals are going to be paramount. But anyway, I highly recommend reading this article, especially if you're in the interview process and maybe you've had some of these whiteboard interviews as an iOS developer and you got all discouraged. I think this is a great article and a great point of view to help you understand the bigger picture on why these companies are asking these sort of questions. This video is going to be all about how you level up those certain skills and preaching patience that it takes time to become a great developer and it takes a long time to learn all this stuff. When I was answering this original email, I came up with a pretty good analogy, if I do say so myself, using a video game character and powering up different attributes. We're going to show you a picture here of, I've been playing Zelda a lot lately. So this is like an example of a decked out iOS developer. He's been doing this for 7 to 10 years. And as you can see in his attribute bars, he's powered up quite a lot of his skills. Now to save space, I can only illustrate a couple of skills, but you can imagine that this list could be 100 of items long based on all the different development stuff that you have to learn. So again, this is an example of what somebody with, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years experience looks like. They've been to battle, they've gained all the skills, they know what they're doing. So now let's switch it up a bit, and here is probably where, a lot of you guys are at, and don't get discouraged that you're not at that, warrior level with full bars. You're just starting out. So as you can see, you only know a little bit about, all these different categories. However, every time that you spent 2 hours, messing with auto layout, trying to get it to work, you're building up that bar. I mean, going back to the warrior we have here, those bars got so big because over the years, he's put in that work of, struggling to learn something and fighting his way through it, fighting through the roadblocks in order to build up those bars. So going back to you, I just want to preach patience. Like, it takes years to build those bars up. And even though you may be starting here where your bars are pretty small, Just be patient, stick with it, fight through the roadblocks. You're going to get there in time. And like I mentioned, this is a process. You're not going to go from that new developer to the high-end warrior developer overnight. It's going to take years. So let's take a look at a mid-level developer, which is where I consider myself at. And as you can see, like some of the bars, you know a lot about some things, but there are some technologies you may not have touched all that much, so you don't know very well. So while I'm confident in my knowledge as a mid-level developer, I still know that I have so much more to learn. Like I'm in the middle of my journey, and I know I still have a few more years to become that warrior developer, but I'm gonna get there someday. And that's the whole point of this video. I wanted to preach patience, that you don't go from that newbie developer to the warrior developer overnight. Like it's a process that takes years. That senior developer didn't build up his AV foundation bar overnight. I mean, that was years of struggling with it, reading through documentation, being stuck on something, building a couple apps in it. I mean, it takes years to build that up. So again, moral of this video, patience. You may be here at the newbie level. Give it time, stick with it, and then before you know it, here you are, a mid-level engineer. And again, keep pounding away, keep sticking with it, keep fighting, and then before you know it, a couple years goes by, and here you are, a ninja warrior.